Hello, I'm Davis Ellison, a strategic analyst here at the Hague Center for Strategic Studies, and I am joined today by Dr. Jakkie Cilliers as part of the Hague Strategic Foresight Forum talks that we just wrapped up here in the Netherlands. Dr. Cilliers, thank you so much for being on.
Thank you very much.
We'll just go right into it. You had a very interesting presentation on the futures of the world, but also particularly Africa within it. And so I just wanted to start out by asking you, in one of your essays, you also described a divided world scenario. And what does that mean, and what does that mean for Africa in particular?
A world, a divided world, a world at war, and a growth world. Trying to illustrate the extent to what happens globally has a huge impact on Africa, whether you're speaking of average incomes, poverty, carbon emissions, and so on and so forth, and the extent to which the world is interconnected. And some problems, climate change, are really global issues, organized crime and so on. They can only be resolved through a multilateral system. So our current trajectory is sort of this divided world at war kind of trajectory, which is a world of bipolarity, of clubs, there is some global commons, but it's quite limited. And the problem is that historically, of course, a reform of the multilateral system has only followed real crisis, First World War, Second World War. And are we again headed in that direction? And what happens with these interconnected problems that I've mentioned, particularly climate change, which is really a problem that affects the developing world, or the global south, much more seriously, but the impact of that through migration and so on and so forth is, I think, going to have global ramifications, particularly for Europe. So I think that the way in which the interconnected world interacts with one another in a more crowded and a hot, flat world is really something we all need to consider.
Certainly, and you mentioned in your talk the developmental perspective in talking about and thinking about security. I wonder if you could just give a brief summary of what that looks like.
Yeah, I think I was trying to make the point that at the moment, this divided world, particularly competition between the US and China, increasingly is looking at hard security issues, Taiwan, Ukraine, Gaza, and so on, and that our interests, speaking from an African perspective, there are developmental concerns. So our primary interest is stability and predictability, and that the competition that we see emerging, this again bipolar kind of structure, is really, we don't want that. Africa needs the US, it needs the European Union, it needs China, for different reasons. We can't and we don't want to make a choice. Our choice is really to prioritize developmental issues, because that's where our problems lie. And those problems, over time, become the West's problems as well, given the interconnectedness that I spoke about.
We talked briefly before, but I think, the importance of the trajectories for those other regions for Africa. You started to touch on the inverse relationship between democracy and capitalism and how that has been evolving. I wonder, again, expanding a bit on that and again connecting that a bit back to what that means for the continent.
So I think looking at where democracy is going and the role of capital, it seems like whereas elected democratic governments are supposed to control money and technology, in actual fact the reverse is happening. That particularly in the US, money is controlling politics, and large companies, particularly social media and internet companies, were largely created through loose money in the US from the 1980s onwards, and through quantitative easing and so on. And they are now determining what happens politically, and they are so powerful, and their instruments are so, social media in particular, are so poisonous in terms of the impact that it has on democracy. And governments are not controlling that. Elected governments, and it's their responsibility to, in actual fact, regulate capital. But what is now happening is that capital seems to be determining democracy through the power and the wealth that has been accumulated through the loose money that I referred to. And of course, the barons of capital are all libertarians that want more freedom and to be able to exploit everybody and anybody to their bottom line benefit. And I think it's undermining democracy and it's undermining multilateralism, and it needs to be brought under control. They are not elected. Governments are elected, and governments need to regulate the power of capital, and I think that's a big problem, not only in the West but globally. Print media, responsible journalism no longer exists because all the ads go to Google, and so on. There are many examples we can use, and the result is the world has descended into echo chambers where the loudest and the most obnoxious echo chamber wins, and that is not a world that builds democracy, equity, that is well informed and that is based on evidence. It's a world of emotion and hate and rage, and I think that is a real threat to democracy in the West, never mind globally. So I think there are real issues about the relationship between democracy and capital, and to a degree globalization, that need to be addressed.
I think we've really been able to touch on some very fundamental issues, and I think what's been really valued has been the wider perspective that you've been able to bring. So thank you very much for your time at this whole event and your time here in this interview, and we look forward to keeping in touch and talking more.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.